Welcome back to Biographics. I'm your host, Cosmic Horror Madman Eric Malachite, and today we're talking about a subject that has been giving me nightmares since I saw Terminator 2 as a child. That's right, nuclear bombs. Or rather, more specifically, a figure who was instrumental in the success of the Manhattan Project. No, not Oppenheimer, but rather Klaus Fuchs. Today's script was provided by Ben Edelman. If he's provided socials, they'll be linked right alongside my own. With that said, let's get to it. The release of the hit film Oppenheimer has led to increased public interest in the true story of the Manhattan Project, the effort of a combined team of American and British scientists to create an atomic bomb during World War II. The film accurately shows the conflicted emotions those scientists had about their work, which resulted in the development of the most destructive weapon mankind has ever known, as well as efforts from the Soviet Union to acquire the secrets of the bomb for themselves through the use of spies. The USSR's chief spy in the Manhattan Project was also instrumental in its creation, Klaus Fuchs. Fuchs was considered one of the UK's top scientific minds and was recruited to work on the atomic bomb project almost from the beginning of it. Exiled from his native Germany by the rise of Hitler, Fuchs was happy to work on the bomb project because he believed it was necessary to defeat the Nazis. What not even his closest friends and associates realized, however, was that Fuchs was also a devoted communist who was passing on all the nuclear secrets he was learning to Soviet agents. Unlike other spies, Fuchs wasn't motivated by money. He was a true believer in the effectiveness of the communist system to heal society's ills, and also that the Western allies shouldn't have a monopoly on the atomic bomb. If world peace was to be maintained, a balance of power was required. He continued passing information to the Soviets until he was caught in 1949, much to the embarrassment of the British security services, who had identified him as a possible security risk for years but done nothing about it. His information accelerated the progress of the USSR's own bomb project, making him potentially one of the most consequential spies in history. Klaus Fuchs was born on December 29, 1911. He grew up in Eisenach, a central German town best known for being the birthplace of classical composer Johann Sebastian Bach. His father, Emil Fuchs, was a Lutheran minister and professor of theology, well known for his pacifist and socialist views that his children, including Klaus, adopted from a young age, even though it made them very unpopular in town. By the time Fuchs entered the University of Leipzig in 1930, Germany's post-war experiment with democracy was coming apart at the seams. Many Germans were flocking to the banner of Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party, whose aggressive and authoritarian views horrified the Fuchs family. All of them became enthusiastic anti-Nazis, though none were more active in their cause than Klaus and his older brother Gerhard, who became active participants in student political organizations, first for the Social Democrats and then for the Communists. Political demonstrations and meetings of this period were often accompanied by vicious street fighting, particularly between the Nazis and the Communists. Klaus had 3 front teeth knocked out in one brawl, and was nearly killed in another one when he was beaten and thrown into a river. However, opposition from people like the Fuchses could not prevent Hitler and the Nazis from taking power in January 1933, and Germany's new overlords took drastic steps to eliminate their political opponents, particularly the Communists. Klaus went into hiding, but with the Gestapo on his trail, he eventually fled the country, immigrating to the United Kingdom in September 1993, where he resumed his university studies, earning a PhD in physics from the University of Bristol in 1937. Considered to be a brilliant scientist by everyone who knew him, Fuchs was given a research post at the University of Edinburgh, working for the celebrated physicist Max Born, who would be awarded a Nobel Prize in 1954 for his work on quantum mechanics. The Fuchs family paid a heavy price for their anti-Nazi activities. By 1939, 3 of the 4 Fuchs children were in exile from Germany, including Klaus, while the 4th, Elizabeth, committed suicide by throwing herself out of a train. However, this activity did not prevent Klaus from being labeled as an enemy alien by the British government. After the outbreak of the Second World War, and in June 1940, he was taken into custody and spent 6 months at internment camps on the Isle of Man in Canada, Initially, the authorities made almost no distinction between Germans who had fled oppression from the Nazis, like Fuchs, and military prisoners of war taken on the battlefield who were often the most fanatical. It only served to harden the beliefs Fuchs had been secretly carrying with him since he first came to the UK, which we'll get into in a bit. Fuchs was returned to Britain in January 1941 and was soon asked to work on a new project, which turned out to be one of the most consequential scientific endeavors ever undertaken. Ever since nuclear fission, the splitting of the uranium atom by firing a neutron into it, had first been achieved in 1938, the scientific community had grown increasingly confident that this process could be harnessed to create a weapon with enormous destructive power: the atomic bomb. With the alarming knowledge that German scientists were already working on developing this technology, a sense of urgency developed among the Allies to create the weapon first, as the outcome of the war might very well depend on it. The British government set up a top-secret program, codenamed tube alloys, to develop an atomic weapon in 1941, and the project needed all the physicists and mathematicians it could get in order to complete the complex calculations needed to get the bomb to actually work. And Klaus Fuchs just happened to be both. So, despite still being classified as an enemy alien, within 6 months of returning to the country, he was recruited into the UK's most top-secret project. He was considered so essential to tube alloys that project leadership sidestepped rules that prohibited enemy aliens from having access to top-secret information by referring to Fuchs and other refugee German scientists as consultants. One of the most important problems Fuchs worked on was how to acquire enough nuclear material to make a bomb with it. Only 0.7% of natural uranium is made up of the isotope U-235, which is the only uranium isotope that triggers a chain reaction of nuclear fission large enough to set off an atomic explosion, and uranium itself was already hard to come by, with most of the world's supply coming from a single mine in the Belgian Congo. The answer was a gaseous diffusion plant, where uranium gas is pumped through filters in order to separate the microscopic amounts of U-235 from the rest of the material. Fuchs worked on the theoretical calculations that examined which types of filters and how many thousands of times the gas needed to pass through them in order to create a pure sample of U-235, among many other questions. In the summer of 1942, despite wartime restrictions, Fuchs was made a naturalized British citizen, and around the same time he signed paperwork that made him subject to the Official Secrets Act, which made the disclosure of any top-secret information to anyone not authorized to know it a crime. It soon became clear to the British that they lacked the manpower and the resources to effectively create an atomic bomb on their own. Any gaseous diffusion plant would be expensive and time-consuming to build, and it would present a huge and obvious target to German bombers. However, by this time, the United States had entered the war on the Allied side, and they were just as determined to build a bomb before the Germans managed to as the British were. According to the terms of the 1943 Quebec Agreement, the British scientists working on tube alloys were to merge together with those of the American effort, codenamed the Manhattan Project, to create a combined effort to make a bomb. Crucially, it was decided to keep the project a secret from the Allies' third major partner, the Soviet Union. Fuchs was one of the British scientists selected to be sent to the United States to help facilitate the project there. After spending several months in New York, Fuchs was transferred to Camp Y, the top-secret facility in Los Alamos, New Mexico, where the creation of the atomic bomb was to take place. The head scientist at Los Alamos, Robert Oppenheimer, who should, I guess, sound familiar, had decided that the process of diffusion to make enough U-235 was taking too long, and that Manhattan Project scientists needed to switch their efforts to a bomb made using plutonium, a material much easier to produce in large quantities. This required a completely different bomb design in order to make it work, however, which required more complex calculations. Fuchs was considered vital to this new initiative, the only theoretical physicist who was actively working on the designs for the explosive lenses that would surround the plutonium core of the bomb. All of the lenses needed to go off at precisely the same moment in order to create the chain reaction needed to ignite the plutonium, otherwise the result would be a much less powerful explosion. Not only was his work important, but he got along well with his colleagues, who together represented some of the foremost concentrations of scientific talent ever assembled in one place. Fuchs's next-door neighbor at Los Alamos was Richard Feynman, who would go on to win the Nobel Prize, became famous for helping to investigate the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster, and is today remembered as one of the greatest physicists of all time. Oppenheimer set the date for the first atomic explosion for July 16, 1949, in the New Mexico desert near the town of Alamogordo. Fuchs was one of the scientists who were present at 5:30 a.m. that day when the bomb nicknamed the Gadget was set off. Night turned to day as a large mushroom cloud shot over 7 miles into the sky. The explosive yield was calculated as being the equivalent of 20 kilotons, or 20,000 tons of TNT, entire orders of magnitude larger than any other man-made explosion in history up to that point. Few people cheered the result of the Trinity test. Most people were shocked by what they had witnessed. 2 months earlier, the world situation had changed dramatically. The Nazi regime had collapsed. Germany had been invaded from all sides by the Allies, Berlin was taken by the Soviets, and Hitler had committed suicide. Germany surrendered on May 7th, ending the war in Europe. With the Nazis defeated, many of the scientists at Los Alamos began to speculate that perhaps their work on the atomic bomb should stop. The American government, however, had another agenda. The day after the Trinity test, President Harry Truman revealed the existence of the atomic bomb to Joseph Stalin for the first time at the Potsdam Conference in Germany, in an attempt to intimidate the Soviet leader. Stalin didn't noticeably react. What Truman didn't know at the time was that he already knew about it. 3 weeks later, the rest of the world found out about the new weapons as 2 atomic bombs were dropped on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing over 200,000 people. In the end, both designs that Fuchs had helped to create had been used, a U-235 bomb on Hiroshima and a plutonium bomb on Nagasaki. 6 days later, Japan surrendered to the Allies, bringing World War II to an end, and with his job done, it was time for Klaus Fuchs to go back to his adopted homeland. Klaus Fuchs came back from America as one of the most well-respected scientists not only in the UK but in the entire world, and he immediately secured an important new job as the head of the Theoretical Physics Division at the newly founded Atomic Energy Research Establishment, which was set up at an old Air Force base in the village of Harwell, only a few miles south of the famous Oxford University. With the war over, the two world powers were now unquestionably the United States and the Soviet Union. The US had gone back on its secret commitment to share nuclear secrets with the UK, determined to keep for themselves a monopoly on nuclear weapons for as long as possible. Feeling their status being rapidly diminished, the British wanted an atomic bomb of their own, and to accomplish it, they turned to many of the same scientists who would help the Americans build theirs, including Fuchs. By all indications, Fuchs had a good life at Harwell. He was working on engaging in important research not only on weapons, but also on peaceful uses for nuclear energy. The construction of nuclear reactors that could generate electrical power, which was a particular passion of his. As at Los Alamos, he was friendly with most of his colleagues, though he got mixed reviews as a supervisor. The only hint of scandal that surrounded him was the fact that basically everyone at Harwell knew or suspected that he was carrying on an affair with Erna, the wife of his friend and boss Herbert Skinner, but nobody made a fuss about it. And then, in the fall of 1949, the bottom fell out, and the secret life of Klaus Fuchs was exposed for the world to see. In September 1949, the American and British governments were made aware of the fact that the Soviet Union had successfully detonated its first atomic bomb. The West no longer had a monopoly on nuclear weapons, which was alarming in and of itself. But what was particularly concerning was that most analysts had predicted that the USSR wouldn't have their first bomb until 1952 at the earliest. What had happened to speed up the timetable? Intelligence agencies for both countries soon believed that they had their answer. Diplomatic cables sent between the Soviet consulate in New York and Moscow had been intercepted by the Signal Intelligence Service beginning in 1943, and analysts had been working to decrypt them ever since. One recently decrypted message sent in 1944 indicated that there had been a British scientist in America who was passing nuclear secrets to Soviet spies. There was a traitor in the Manhattan Project. When the British counterintelligence service MI5 began investigating the scientists who had helped the Americans with the bomb project, they were alarmed to discover that the file they had on Klaus Fuchs was already extensive. He had been investigated 7 different times since he first entered the country in 1934, with multiple agents expressing concern about Fuchs's affiliation with the Communist Party in Germany, as well as his continued association with known communists once he arrived in the UK. Fuchs became MI5's prime suspect. He himself had written the technical document that had been intercepted. His movements matched those of the agent described in the intercepted cable, and he also had a sister in the US, Christelle, who lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Agents began round-the-clock surveillance of Fuchs, including reading his mail, tapping his phone, and bugging his home so they could hear all conversations that occurred there. If they were hoping for some secret rendezvous with Russian agents or a dramatic declaration of loyalty to the cause of communism, they were going to be disappointed. The surveillance picked up nothing incriminating. To make matters worse, they couldn't use the intercepted cables as evidence against them because the US wanted to keep their decryption effort, named the Veronica Project, a secret for as long as possible. It wouldn't be declassified until 1995. Unless they got him to confess, the best they could do was to remove Fuchs from his position at Harwell as a security risk. It came as a surprise to everyone when, in January 1950, Fuchs did just that, confessed to everything. He had been interrogated several times in the previous weeks and hadn't given anything up, so his sudden willingness to talk shocked the investigators. It's unlikely that Fuchs realized just how flimsy the case against him was. In the end, it seemed his own arrogance did him in. He actually seemed to believe that if he confessed to what he'd done, not only would he not be prosecuted for it, but he would be allowed to keep his position at Harwell. Even if he'd been led to believe this would happen by his investigator, it was still remarkably short-sighted, especially for a man as intelligent as Fuchs was, who'd escaped detention for as long as he had. And it had been a long time, as Fuchs would confess. He'd been passing information to the Soviets since 1941 when he first began working on tube alloys. The secret sharing continued when he made it to America, first in New York and then in New Mexico. The information he passed to various other Soviet agents included all the inside information on the Manhattan Project that Fuchs had access to, which was almost all of it, since he volunteered to work on multiple different areas. He continued acting as one of the USSR's most important spies after the war ended, at Harwell right up to about a year before he was caught. Many people asked why a man like Fuchs, who had a good life in his adopted country, would choose to betray it in favor of a nation he'd never even visited. The answer to that was simple. Fuchs was a committed believer in the communist cause, which was, as he saw it, to eventually overthrow all of the world's capitalist governments and replace them with socialist ones. He'd been a communist since he'd arrived in the country. But the most likely tipping point for him came when he was detained as an enemy alien in several internment camps in 1940, often in squalid conditions and with little, if any, distinction made between refugees like him and captured German soldiers who were fanatical Nazis. It only reinforced a belief that Fuchs already had, that the capitalist West wanted the Germans and Soviets to fight themselves to exhaustion before swooping in at the last minute to defeat them both. While in the camps, Fuchs made important contacts with other German communists like himself, contacts who would put him in touch with Soviet agents once he was released. Fuchs was happy to work on the atomic bomb project for the Allies because he believed the Nazis needed to be defeated at all costs. But he also disagreed with the decision to keep the project secret from the Soviets, who were also fighting the Nazis. In his view, if only one country or one power bloc had access to the bomb, another world war was inevitable. Sharing the secrets of the bomb with the Soviets, therefore, was Fuchs's idea of maintaining world peace. The The Fuchs affair was a major scandal for British intelligence, particularly MI5, who had routinely overlooked his questionable past activities because the work he was doing was so important to the war effort. It widened a growing rift with the United States, whose government believed the British were too incompetent to be trusted with nuclear secrets. As for Fuchs himself, he was arrested and pleaded guilty to violating the Official Secrets Act. Even though many people called for his execution as a spy, he would not be because the Soviet Union was a British ally during the war, and even in 1950 was still classified as a friendly nation. Sentenced to 14 years imprisonment, he was released on good behavior in 1959 and immediately left the country, settling in East Germany, where a communist government had been set up after the war. Fuchs spent the rest of his life there, marrying and making a comfortable living for himself as a teacher and a technical advisor, though he was never permitted to work on weapons research again. He died in 1988 and was given a state funeral in East Berlin. One of the attendees was a 35-year-old KGB agent named Vladimir Putin. It is doubtless that Fuchs would have been disappointed with the fall of the communist bloc, which did not long outlive him. Klaus Fuchs is, without a doubt, one of the most infamous spies in history. The most important question about his life, though, is one that we may never know the answer to. How impactful was his information on the USSR's atomic research? It is likely that what he passed on sped up the process for the Soviets. They probably exploded their first bomb a year or two earlier than they would have without it. While that may not seem like much in the grand scheme of things, it may have made a huge difference. Had the US been the only nuclear-armed power at the height of the Korean War in 1950, Harry Truman may have been convinced to use the bomb either on North Korea or on China. Who knows how the world would look today if that had happened? What do you think? Was Klaus right? Comment your answer down below, and if you dug this video, be sure to do all that algorithmic jazz. I'm Eric Malachite, and I'll see you next time, Space Cowboy.